St. Louis, Missouri, summer twilight, 1888. The air thick with malt and Mississippi heat. A brewery complex spreads across 142 acres, brick towers, copper vats the size of houses, cellars tunneling 3 stories underground, steam hisses. Horses drag wagons stacked 8 barrels high. 1,200 workers move through shifts that never stop. Above it all, a mansion. Renaissance revival, limestone and iron, 50 rooms, gardens clipped to geometric perfection. Inside sits Adolphus Busch, 46 years old, German immigrant, married into the Anheuser family. He controls the largest brewery in America. Annual production, 141,000 barrels. Revenue, $2.8 million. Profit margin, 38%. This is not a story about beer. It is a story about how one family weaponized immigration, technology, and ruthless vertical integration to build an empire, and then discovered that empires built on taste are at the mercy of law, morality, and change. Was Budweiser capitalism at its most efficient, or exploitation at its most profitable? To understand what Adolphus Busch built, you have to understand the ground that made it possible. St. Louis in the 1850s was not yet a major city. It was a threshold, a river port where the Mississippi bent and the Missouri fed in from the west, a place where goods stopped moving by water and started moving by rail. Steamboats unloaded cotton, wheat, and timber. Railroads carried them deeper into the interior. By 1860, 6 rail lines terminated in St. Louis. The city was a hinge between the agricultural South, the industrial East, and the raw frontier beyond. That made it a place of opportunity and transience. People arrived with nothing and either moved on or stayed to build. The city's population in 1850 stood near 78,000. By 1860, it exceeded 160,000, more than doubled in a decade. A significant share of that growth came from a single source: German immigrants. They arrived in waves after the failed revolutions of 1848 across the German states: political refugees, economic migrants, families fleeing consolidation and conscription. They crossed the Atlantic in steerage, landed in New York or Baltimore, and many kept moving west. St. Louis drew them because work was plentiful and land was cheap. By 1860, more than 50,000 Germans lived in the city, nearly a third of the total population. They settled in neighborhoods north of downtown. They opened shops, churches, singing societies, and beer gardens. They brought language, customs, and a particular approach to brewing. American drinking culture in the mid-19th century leaned heavily toward whiskey, corn liquor, rye, bourbon, hard spirits consumed quickly in saloons. Beer existed, but it was mostly English-style ale, brewed warm and drunk within days before it soured. The Germans brought lager, a different process, bottom-fermenting yeast that worked in cold temperatures, producing a cleaner, lighter beer that could be stored for weeks or months without spoiling. Lager required ice, lots of it. Winter ice cut from frozen rivers and ponds, packed in sawdust, stored in deep cellars to keep fermentation temperatures low through the summer. The infrastructure was expensive. The payoff was a product that traveled better and tasted consistent. St. Louis had 40 breweries by 1860. Most were small operations, family-run, supplying a neighborhood or a handful of saloons. Production rarely exceeded a few thousand barrels annually. Competition was local and fierce. Profit margins were thin. Brewers who wanted to grow needed capital, distribution networks, and the ability to survive price wars. Most didn't have those things. A few did. Eberhard Anheuser was not a brewer by training. He was a soap manufacturer. Born in Germany, immigrated in his 20s, settled in St. Louis, and made money in soap and candles during the 1840s and 50s. In 1860, he took possession of a failing brewery as payment for a debt. The Bavarian Brewery, located on the south side near the riverfront. It was small, producing roughly 8,000 barrels a year, losing money, poorly managed. Anheuser saw something others didn't. Not the brewery as it was, but what it could become if properly run and properly financed. He had capital, he had business discipline. What he lacked was deep knowledge of brewing and, more critically, the charisma and sales instinct needed to expand beyond local markets. Adolphus Busch arrived in St. Louis in 1857. He was 18 years old. The youngest of 21 children from a prosperous family near Mainz, Germany, he had some education, some money, and an appetite for risk. He worked as a salesman for a brewing supply company, selling hops, malt, and equipment to the city's many small breweries. The job put him inside dozens of operations. He saw who was competent and who was floundering. He learned the technical side of brewing, the economics of scale, and the importance of reputation. He was charming, fluent in German and English, comfortable in beer gardens and boardrooms alike. In 1861, at age 22, he married Lily Anheuser, Eberhard's daughter. The marriage was strategic. Lily brought a dowry and, more importantly, a pathway into her father's business. 3 years later, in 1864, Adolphus Busch joined Anheuser and Company as a partner. The initial capitalization was $30,000, roughly $550,000 in 2025 terms. Not a fortune, but substantial, enough to expand capacity, improve equipment, and begin thinking beyond St. Louis. The partnership was complementary. Anheuser provided stability, capital, and operational oversight. Busch provided vision, salesmanship, and an instinct for branding that was rare in an industry that mostly sold beer by the barrel to saloons with no name attached. The timing was significant. The country was midway through the Civil War. St. Louis remained in Union hands, and federal contracts for provisions kept money moving through the city. Breweries supplied beer to military camps and hospitals. Demand was high. Profit margins were better than peacetime. Anheuser and Busch expanded production steadily through the war years. By 1865, output exceeded 15,000 barrels annually, nearly double what the Bavarian brewery had produced when Anheuser acquired it. The war ended. The country began its long westward push. Railroads extended into territories that would become states. Towns appeared along the tracks. Settlers, miners, soldiers, and railroad workers all drank beer. The question was whose beer they would drink. Most breweries thought locally. Busch thought nationally. He understood that the brewery with the best distribution would dominate. Not the best beer, though quality mattered. The best distribution, the one that could deliver reliably to the most towns, the most saloons, the most consumers. He saw that the railroads made this possible for the first time in American history. Beer could move 1,000 miles if it survived the journey. The problem was that most beer didn't. Heat, jostling, time, all of it turned beer sour within days. Busch needed a solution. He would find one, and it would change everything. The world that made Anheuser-Busch was one of displacement and appetite. Immigrants who brought skills and culture, a city positioned at the intersection of river and rail, an industry fragmented into dozens of small competitors, and two men, one with capital and discipline, the other with ambition and vision, who understood that beer was not a craft, it was a commodity. And commodities belonged to whoever could produce them at scale, distribute them without limit, and brand them so effectively that consumers asked for them by name. That work was just beginning. In 1873, Adolphus Busch assumed operational control of the brewery. Eberhard Anheuser remained president in title, but the daily decisions, the strategic direction, and the public face of the company now belonged to his son-in-law. Busch was 34 years old. He had spent 9 years learning the business from within, watching competitors, studying failures, and identifying the single obstacle that kept beer regional: spoilage. Beer lasted 2 weeks at most before it turned sour. That limitation defined the industry. Brewers could only sell what they could deliver fresh. Markets were local by necessity, not choice. Busch knew that whoever solved the spoilage problem would control not just St. Louis, but the entire country. The solution already existed. Louis Pasteur, the French chemist, had published his work on heating liquids to kill bacteria in the 1860s. Pasteurization. The process was being applied to wine and milk. Busch saw no reason it couldn't work for beer. In 1873, he began experimenting. Heat the beer after fermentation, but before bottling. Not to boiling, which would ruin the flavor, but to a temperature high enough to kill the organisms that caused spoilage. Hold that temperature briefly, then cool. The technique required precision. Too much heat destroyed the product. Too little left bacteria alive. Busch worked with his brewmasters, testing temperatures, timing, and methods, until they found the range that worked. The result was immediate and transformative. Beer that had spoiled in 2 weeks now remained drinkable for 6 months or longer. The shelf life increased by a factor of 12. The implications were staggering. Beer could now travel 1,000 miles and still arrive fresh. A brewery in St. Louis could supply saloons in San Francisco, New Orleans, New York. Geography no longer dictated market size, but pasteurization alone was not enough. Beer still had to survive the journey. Summer heat in a railcar could ruin even pasteurized beer. Busch needed refrigeration on wheels. Refrigerated railcars existed, but were primitive. Insulated boxes packed with ice, harvested in winter, and stored in sawdust. The ice melted. The cars warmed. Beer arrived spoiled anyway. Busch approached railroad companies directly. He proposed partnerships. Anheuser-Busch would invest in building better refrigerated cars with thicker insulation, better ventilation, and more ice capacity. In exchange, the railroads would prioritize his shipments and offer favorable freight rates. By 1880, Busch had contracts with 12 railroad lines. The cars moved his beer across the country on schedules he controlled, at costs his competitors couldn't match. The combination of pasteurization and refrigerated transport was a weapon. Competitors without access to either technology couldn't compete beyond their home cities. Busch could deliver fresh beer anywhere a railroad ran. In 1876, Busch launched a new brand, Budweiser. Named after the Czech brewing town of Budweis, known for its pale lagers. The name carried European prestige without being explicitly German, an advantage as anti-immigrant sentiment simmered. The timing was deliberate. 1876 was the American Centennial. Celebrations filled the summer. The Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia drew millions. Busch sent representatives with samples. He advertised Budweiser as a national beer for a reunited nation, modern, clean, consistent. The pitch worked. Orders came from cities Anheuser-Busch had never reached before. The brand caught. Within 5 years, Budweiser outsold every other product the brewery made. Busch understood that controlling production was only the first step. He needed to control every stage between brewery and glass. Vertical integration. He purchased bottle factories so he wouldn't depend on outside suppliers. He built ice plants so winter ice shortages couldn't slow production. He bought rail cars outright, leasing them back to the railroads under terms he dictated. He constructed distribution warehouses in major cities, regional hubs where beer could be stored and delivered locally without returning to St. Louis. Every link in the chain, from grain to glass, came under Anheuser-Busch ownership or control. Costs dropped. Competitors who had to purchase bottles, rent rail cars, and contract for ice couldn't match his prices. Then came advertising. Most breweries spent little on marketing. Their beer sold itself, or it didn't. Busch saw advertising as another form of distribution. He hired artists to create lithograph posters, tavern scenes, patriotic imagery, women in classical poses holding glasses of Budweiser. The posters went to saloons nationwide, free, as long as the saloon agreed to display them prominently. He commissioned calendars with Budweiser branding and gave them to retailers. He produced pocket knives, corkscrews, and trays stamped with the logo, small objects that put the brand into customers' hands. By the 1890s, Anheuser-Busch spent $500,000 annually on advertising, roughly $16 million in 2025 currency. No competitor came close. The result was a brand that consumers recognized and requested by name, a rarity in an industry where beer was often just beer. Busch deployed another strategy, quieter and more ruthless: the tied house system. He identified saloon owners who were struggling, behind on rent, short on capital. He offered loans, generous terms, low interest, sometimes no interest at all. The condition was simple. The saloon would serve Budweiser exclusively, no competitors' beer on the taps, no competitors' signs on the walls. The loan gave Busch leverage. A saloon owner who took the money was locked in. If he tried to switch to another brewery, Busch could call the loan. Few could repay. By 1895, more than 2,000 saloons across the country operated under exclusive Budweiser contracts. Busch owned their loyalty without owning the properties. Competitors found themselves shut out of entire neighborhoods, sometimes entire cities. The tied house system was legal. It was also predatory. Economies of scale gave Busch another advantage. The more beer Anheuser-Busch produced, the lower the cost per barrel. By 1880, production reached 141,000 barrels annually. Larger breweries could spread fixed costs over more output. That meant Busch could underprice competitors and still turn a profit. He did exactly that. When a regional brewery tried to enter a new city, Busch dropped his price below cost until the competitor withdrew or went bankrupt. Once the competitor was gone, prices rose again. The tactic was effective and repeated. Dozens of smaller breweries collapsed through the 1880s and 90s, not because their beer was inferior, but because they couldn't survive a price war with Anheuser-Busch. By 1890, Budweiser was distributed to all 44 states. Shipments went to Mexico, Central America, South America, and Europe. Anheuser-Busch was no longer a St. Louis brewery. It was a national corporation with international reach. The cost of this expansion was borne by those outside the ledgers. Skilled brewers at small independent breweries lost their jobs when their employers folded. Saloon owners who took Busch's loans found themselves trapped in contracts they couldn't escape. Workers at the Anheuser-Busch complex, 1,200 strong by 1889, labored in shifts that never stopped. The machinery of production demanded bodies. Bottles had to be filled, barrels loaded, rail cars packed. The work was repetitive, dangerous, and relentless. Busch paid wages that were competitive for the time, but the work consumed lives. Men entered the brewery at dawn and left at dusk, 6 days a week, year after year, building wealth they would never share. Busch himself was tireless. He traveled constantly, visiting distributors, meeting with railroad executives, touring new markets. He entertained lavishly, hosting dinners where business was conducted over wine and cigars. He cultivated relationships with politicians, journalists, and civic leaders. His charm was a tool. His ambition was boundless. By the end of the 1880s, Adolphus Busch had done what no American brewer had done before. He had made beer a national product, distributed across thousands of miles, recognized by millions of consumers, supported by an industrial infrastructure that crushed competition as efficiently as it produced barrels. He had built an empire. The question was whether the empire could be sustained. By 1900, the brewery complex covered 142 acres on the south side of St. Louis. 110 buildings filled the site. Brick towers rose 5 and 6 stories, housing grain elevators, malt storage, and brewing kettles. Copper vats large enough to hold 10,000 gallons stood in rows under iron trussed roofs. Steam pipes carried heat. Water lines fed every floor. The scale was industrial, but the surface was ornamental. The administration building, completed in 1892, rose at the complex's center in Renaissance Revival style. Red brick with limestone trim, arched windows framed in carved stone, a clock tower visible from blocks away. Inside, stained glass filtered light into lobbies paneled in oak. Marble stairs climbed to offices furnished with imported rugs and brass fixtures. The building was functional, but its purpose was display. Visitors, distributors, and journalists who toured the brewery entered through that building. The message was clear. This was not a rough industrial operation. This was a corporation with refinement, capital, and permanence. Beneath the surface, the real work happened underground. Cellars tunneled 3 stories deep into the limestone bedrock. The temperature stayed near freezing year-round, maintained by thick walls and winter ice packed into insulated chambers. By 1900, the cellars held 200,000 barrels. Workers descended on ladders and moved through tunnels lit by dim electric bulbs. The air was cold and damp. Barrels were stacked floor to ceiling, aging until ready for bottling. The cellar system was a feat of engineering and a statement of capacity. No competitor had storage on this scale. The ability to hold 200,000 barrels meant Anheuser-Busch could brew year-round and release product according to demand, not the limitations of fermentation time. It gave the company flexibility and control that smaller breweries lacked. Above ground, 1 mile north of the brewery, Adolphus Busch built his residence. 1 Busch Place. Construction began in the 1870s on a plot of land elevated above the river valley. The mansion started modestly, perhaps 20 rooms, but expanded through the 1880s and 90s as Busch's wealth compounded. By 1900, the house exceeded 50 rooms and 30,000 square feet. The style was eclectic. Renaissance Revival, Second Empire, Victorian ornament, all blended into a structure that announced arrival and permanence. Limestone facade, slate roof, iron balconies, porte cochere for carriages. The interiors carried imported materials, marble fireplaces from Italy, mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, silk wallpaper. Rooms were designated by function: drawing room, music room, billiard room, library, conservatory, ballroom. 30 to 40 servants staffed the house full-time. Cooks, maids, footmen, gardeners, stable hands, laundresses, each had a role. The machine of domestic life ran as precisely as the brewery below. The grounds extended over several acres. Italian-style gardens arranged in geometric beds. Boxwood hedges clipped to sharp edges. Gravel paths, marble statuary imported from Europe. Conservatories held tropical plants and citrus trees that fruited year-round. Stables housed 40 horses, some for carriage work, others for riding. A private zoo occupied one corner of the property, 15 species documented by visitors, including deer, peacocks, and exotic birds. A gatehouse stood at the entrance, staffed by an attendant who controlled access. The estate was private, but it was also theater. Selected guests, journalists, and business associates were invited to tour. Photographs of the mansion and grounds appeared in newspapers and magazines. The coverage was intentional. Busch wanted the public to see what his success had built. One Busch Place sat on a hill. From the upper floors and from the terraces, the view extended south toward the brewery complex. On clear days, the clock tower was visible. The sight line was not accidental. The mansion overlooked the source of its wealth. The spatial relationship was hierarchical. Busch at the top, literally and figuratively, looking down on the operation that produced his fortune. The workers who made that fortune lived below, closer to the brewery, in housing Busch provided. Company-built tenements lined the streets near the brewery. Brick row houses, 3 and 4 stories, each building divided into units that housed 4 to 6 families. The construction was utilitarian: small rooms, shared hallways, outdoor privies in the early years. Indoor plumbing added in the 1890s, but minimal. Rent was deducted from wages. The housing was better than many urban slums of the period, but it was also a mechanism of control. A worker who lived in company housing and owed rent to his employer had limited options. Quitting meant eviction. Complaining risked both. By 1900, approximately 400 families lived in these tenements. They could see the brewery every day. Some could see the mansion on the hill. The physical geography made the social order visible. Wealth at the top, labor at the bottom, production in between. Busch did not limit his ambitions to St. Louis. He purchased secondary estates in locations that signaled sophistication and reach. A property in Pasadena, California, where winters were mild and the wealthy gathered. A country home near Cooperstown, New York, in the rural landscapes that wealthy Easterners idealized. A villa in Bad Schwalbach, Germany, in the hills west of Frankfurt. A gesture toward his roots, and a place to retreat when crossing the Atlantic. The German estate was the most revealing. Busch fashioned himself after German-landed nobility. The estate included vineyards, forests, and a manor house that evoked the minor aristocracy of the Rhine. He entertained there, hosted dinners for European business contacts, and cultivated the image of a man who had risen from immigrant origins to something approaching titled status. The comparison was not subtle. In a republic that rejected hereditary titles, Busch constructed a version of aristocracy through wealth, property, and display. In 1885, Busch purchased a team of Clydesdale horses. The breed originated in Scotland, massive draft horses, standing over 17 hands, weighing a ton or more, bred for pulling heavy loads. Busch saw them as more than work animals. He saw them as symbols. The horses were groomed meticulously, their manes braided, their brass harnesses polished. They pulled wagons through St. Louis streets during parades and public events, the wagons loaded with barrels stamped with the Budweiser name. Crowds gathered to watch. Photographers captured the spectacle. The image of the Clydesdales became inseparable from the brand. By 1895, Busch maintained a herd of more than 40 horses, rotating teams for tours and exhibitions. The cost of feeding, housing, and maintaining the herd was substantial, but the return in publicity was incalculable. The horses communicated scale and quality. An operation that could afford to keep 40 Clydesdales was an operation of permanence and power. The monuments Busch built, the mansion, the estates, the Clydesdales, the ornamental brewery buildings were not frivolous. They were strategic. They established Anheuser-Busch as more than a company. They made it an institution, woven into the landscape, visible from multiple vantage points, impossible to ignore. Workers who lived in tenements walked past the mansion's gates. Visitors who toured the brewery saw the stained glass and marble. Parade watchers saw the Clydesdales and associated beauty with a product made in rooms that smelled of hops and malt. The physical world Busch constructed told a story. The story was one of success, refinement, and inevitability. It was also a story of hierarchy, the mansion on the hill, the workers below, the machinery in between, everything arranged to make power visible and permanent. The beer did not make itself. Behind the Renaissance Revival facade and the polished brass fittings, 1,200 workers kept the operation running in 1889. By 1900, that number reached 3,000. By 1905, it exceeded 3,500. The workforce grew as production climbed, and the work remained what it had always been: repetitive, physically demanding, dangerous. The men who filled the brewery came primarily from immigrant communities, Germans in the early years drawn by language and the promise of skilled brewing work, Irish laborers arriving with fewer skills but strong backs. By the turn of the century, Eastern Europeans, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, fleeing rural poverty for industrial wages. Busch hired across ethnic lines, not from principle, but from calculation. A diverse workforce was a divided workforce. Language barriers made organizing difficult. Cultural differences bred suspicion. Men who could not speak to one another easily could not coordinate resistance. The work was organized by department. The brewhouse, where raw ingredients became beer, operated at temperatures that exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Malt roasted in ovens, wort boiled in massive copper kettles. Workers fed fuel, stirred vats, and monitored temperatures, clothed in wool shirts soaked with sweat. Heat exhaustion was common. Burns from steam and splashing liquid happened regularly. The cellars presented the opposite extreme. Dug 3 stories into bedrock, the storage rooms stayed near freezing. Workers moved barrels, cleaned tanks, and monitored fermentation in temperatures that dipped to 5 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Pneumonia was an occupational hazard. Men worked shifts of 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week. 60 to 72 hours weekly, Sundays off, but only one. The machinery demanded constant attention. Production never paused. Shifts rotated. Night workers left as day. Workers arrived. Wages followed skill. Skilled brewers, men who understood fermentation and could diagnose problems by taste and smell, earned $2 to $3 per day. Unskilled laborers, loading barrels, cleaning floors, hauling coal, made $1 to $1.50 per day. Women worked in the bottling rooms, filling, capping, and labeling at speeds that blistered hands. They earned 60 to 80 cents per day, roughly 60 to 80% of what unskilled men received for comparable work. Children appeared in the workforce as well. Boys as young as 12 were documented in bottling and delivery operations. They earned less than women. Families sent sons to work because wages mattered more than schooling. By 1895, an estimated 50 to 100 boys worked on the premises. The practice was legal. Child labor laws, where they existed, were rarely enforced. Injuries were frequent. Men fell from platforms while moving barrels stacked 3 high. Scalding accidents occurred when steam valves failed or workers miscalculated the contents of a vat. Crushing injuries happened in the barrel yards when load shifted. Frostbite was treated by wrapping the affected area and returning to work. Severe injuries meant dismissal. Anheuser-Busch provided no compensation system, no medical care, no support for workers who could no longer perform their duties. An injured man was replaced within days. His family, if they lived in company housing, faced eviction if rent payments lapsed. Contemporary industry studies estimated that 15 to 20% of brewery workers suffered injuries annually. Some recovered. Many did not. The cost was borne entirely by the workers and their families. Attempts to organize met resistance. The brewery workers' union movement gained traction in American cities during the 1890s, advocating for shorter hours, safer conditions, and collective bargaining. Busch opposed unions openly. He argued that his workers were well paid compared to other industries, which was partially true, and that unions would disrupt operations and threaten jobs, which was a warning. Organizers who appeared at the brewery gates were noted. Workers who attended union meetings were identified. Terminations followed. Busch used the company housing stock as leverage. A worker who joined a union risked not only his job but his family's shelter. The threat was effective. Union membership among Anheuser-Busch employees remained below 5% before 1910. The ethnic composition of the workforce aided suppression. German workers distrusted Irish workers. Eastern Europeans were viewed with suspicion by both. Language barriers made cross-ethnic solidarity nearly impossible. Busch exploited these divisions deliberately. Job assignments, wage scales, and housing placements reinforced separation. Unity was structural impossibility. Busch cultivated a public image as a paternalistic employer. He hosted company picnics in the summer, free beer, food, and entertainment for workers and their families. Photographs of these events appeared in newspapers. Christmas brought bonuses, modest sums distributed with speeches praising loyalty and hard work. The gestures were real. They were also calculated. Paternalism functioned as a management tool. A worker who received a Christmas bonus and attended a company picnic was less likely to join a union or agitate for structural change. The benefits cost Busch far less than wage increases or safety improvements would have. They purchased goodwill without ceding power. The gap between public image and private reality was wide. Journalists who toured the brewery saw the stained glass, the Clydesdales, the clean bottling lines staffed by efficient workers. They did not see the cellars at Five Below, the scalded hands, the children filling bottles for pennies, or the families evicted when an injured father could no longer work. Busch controlled access. He controlled the narrative. The company projected an image of modernity, efficiency, and benevolence. The workers who made the beer understood differently. They understood that their labor built the mansion on the hill. They understood that the Clydesdales cost more to maintain than a year's wages for a dozen men. They understood that Budweiser's national dominance was purchased with their bodies. By 1900, Anheuser-Busch was the largest brewery in the world. Production exceeded 1 million barrels annually. The brand was distributed to every state and multiple foreign countries. The company's success was built on technological innovation, vertical integration, and ruthless competition. It was also built on immigrant labor, ethnic division, wage suppression, and the systematic denial of worker power. Adolphus Busch was celebrated in newspapers as a captain of industry, a self-made man, a symbol of American possibility. The men and women who descended into the freezing cellars and stood over boiling kettles remained unnamed. Their injuries were not reported. Their children's labor was not questioned. The cost of production was written in bodies, not ledgers. That cost would eventually come due, though not in ways Busch could foresee. Adolphus Busch died on October 10, 1913, at his estate in Bad Schwalbach, Germany. He was 74 years old. He had been abroad for months, taking the waters at the spa town, a ritual he followed most summers. His health had declined gradually. Heart trouble, circulation problems, the accumulation of years spent traveling, entertaining, and managing an empire that demanded constant attention. The end came quietly. No dramatic collapse, no public spectacle. He died in his bed, attended by family and physicians. Word reached St. Louis by cable within hours. Flags at the brewery complex lowered to half-staff. Newspapers across the country published obituaries praising his vision, his generosity, and his contributions to American industry. The funeral was held in St. Louis weeks later after the body was returned by steamship and rail. Thousands attended, business leaders, politicians, workers from the brewery. The procession moved through streets lined with spectators. Adolphus Busch was buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery in a mausoleum constructed of granite and marble, large enough to hold multiple generations. His estate was valued at approximately $60 million, equivalent to over $1.8 billion in 2025 currency. The fortune included the brewery, real estate holdings in multiple states, stock portfolios, art collections, and the various estates he had accumulated. The wealth was substantial, even by the standards of America's industrial elite. It placed the Busch family among the richest in the country. But wealth of that magnitude created complications. Adolphus had 13 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. He also had multiple grandchildren. The inheritance was structured through complex trust arrangements designed to prevent fragmentation and ensure that the brewery remained under family control. The trusts gave August A. Busch Senior, the eldest son, operational authority and the largest share of the estate. Other heirs received income from the trusts, but not direct control. The arrangement was intended to maintain unity. It also planted seeds of resentment. Siblings who received less questioned why the eldest should command so much. Disputes over trust distributions and management decisions would surface repeatedly in the decades ahead. August Senior was 54 years old when he assumed control. He had worked in the brewery for decades, learning the operation under his father's supervision. He understood production, distribution, and finance. What he lacked was Adolphus's charisma. Adolphus had been a showman, comfortable in public, skilled at cultivating relationships, able to charm journalists, politicians, and competitors alike. August was reserved, formal, more interested in ledgers than publicity. Where Adolphus had pursued aggressive expansion, August favored consolidation. He focused on maintaining what had been built rather than reaching for new markets. His conservatism was not weakness, it was temperament. He believed the company had grown large enough, that further expansion carried risks, that stability mattered more than ambition, that caution would prove both asset and liability in the years ahead. The brewery August inherited was immense. Production in 1913 reached 1.6 million barrels annually, more than any other brewery in the world. Budweiser controlled approximately 25% of the American beer market. The company employed over 6,000 workers across the brewery and distribution network. Assets were estimated at $50 million. The infrastructure Adolphus had built, the rail cars, the ice plants, the tide house, agreements, the national advertising, all of it remained in place. The machine functioned. The question was whether it could function without its architect. Adolphus had died at a particular moment, a hinge point. Two forces that would threaten the dynasty's survival were already gathering strength. The first was anti-German sentiment. Relations between the United States and Germany were deteriorating. War in Europe seemed increasingly likely. If America entered on the side of Britain and France, anything associated with Germany would become suspect. The Busch family name, the company's German roots, the brewery's ties to German immigrant communities, all of it would shift from asset to liability. The second force was the Prohibition movement. For decades, temperance advocates had argued that alcohol caused poverty, crime, and moral decay. By 1913, the movement had gained political power. Multiple states had enacted prohibition laws. A constitutional amendment banning alcohol nationwide was being seriously discussed. If such an amendment passed, the entire brewing industry would be criminalized overnight. August Senior understood both threats. He had watched the temperance movement grow. He had read the editorials questioning the loyalty of German Americans. But understanding and countering were different things. Adolphus had been politically connected, generous with campaign contributions, skilled at shaping public opinion. August was less comfortable in that arena. He preferred to manage the business and hope the external threats would recede. They would not. The dynasty Adolphus built rested on assumptions that were already crumbling. It assumed that immigration, the source of the company's labor and much of its market, would remain politically acceptable. It assumed that beer, a product woven into German-American culture, would retain its social legitimacy. It assumed that scale and efficiency would protect the company from regulatory interference. All three assumptions would be tested within 5 years. August Senior inherited an empire at the moment external forces began to dismantle the world that had made the empire possible. His father had built Anheuser-Busch during an era of minimal regulation, open immigration, and cultural acceptance of alcohol. August would have to defend it during a period of war, nativism, and moral crusade. The tools that had worked for Adolphus, charm, expansion, technological dominance, would not be enough. August would need different strategies. The question was whether he possessed them, and whether any strategy could preserve what his father had created when the law itself turned hostile. The United States entered the First World War on April 6, 1917. President Wilson signed the Declaration. Congress voted overwhelmingly in favor. Within weeks, the country mobilized. Men registered for the draft. Factories retooled for munitions production. Liberty Bond drives swept cities and towns. Patriotic fervor became compulsory, and with it came suspicion. Germany was now the enemy. Anything associated with Germany became suspect. The transformation was sudden and comprehensive. German Americans who had been respected members of their communities, business owners, teachers, skilled workers, were now viewed as potential saboteurs and spies. The language they spoke at home, the cultural organizations they belonged to, the food they ate, all of it marked them as foreign and potentially disloyal. St. Louis had over 60,000 residents of German descent in 1910. They had built churches, schools, singing societies, and businesses. German-language newspapers circulated widely. Beer gardens were social centers. The city's German community was established, prosperous, and visible. That visibility became a liability. Within months of the war declaration, German language instruction was banned in public schools. Street names with German origins were changed. Businesses with German names faced boycotts. Orchestras stopped performing Beethoven and Wagner. Libraries removed German books from shelves. The pressure was social, legal, and occasionally violent. Families anglicized their names. Schmidt became Smith. Muller became Miller. The goal was survival through invisibility. Anheuser-Busch was impossible to make invisible. The name was German. The ownership was German. The product was tied to German beer culture. The company had celebrated its German heritage in advertising for decades, emphasizing old-world craftsmanship and brewing traditions. That heritage, once an asset, now invited attack. August Busch Senior found himself in an impossible position. He could not change his name without appearing to flee his identity. He could not defend his German roots without appearing unpatriotic. The only option was aggressive, visible, unmistakable displays of loyalty. August launched a campaign. He purchased over $5 million in Liberty bonds, war debt issued to finance the military effort. The purchases were publicized in newspapers. Photographs showed August presenting checks to government officials. He gave speeches at war bond rallies, urging others to support the troops. He placed advertisements in newspapers declaring Anheuser-Busch's unwavering support for America and the war effort. The company stopped all German-language advertising immediately. Marketing materials emphasized American themes, patriotic imagery, and the company's contributions to the economy and war effort. August seriously considered changing the company name to remove the German association. Legal consultations were held. The costs and complications ultimately dissuaded him, but the fact that it was considered at all revealed the depth of the threat. The war disrupted production directly. Barley, the primary grain used in brewing, was rationed for food production. The government directed agricultural output toward bread and military rations. Breweries received reduced allocations. Anheuser-Busch's brewing capacity dropped 30 to 40%. The company could not produce at pre-war levels even if demand had remained steady. Demand did not remain steady. Sales declined 15 to 20% during the war years. Some of the decline was economic. Wartime inflation reduced disposable income. Some was cultural. Drinking German beer felt unpatriotic to many consumers. Some was logistical. Railroads prioritized military freight. Beer shipments were delayed or canceled. Labor shortages compounded the problem. Men were drafted or volunteered for military service. An estimated 20 to 25% of the Anheuser-Busch workforce entered the armed forces. Skilled brewers were particularly difficult to replace. Brewing required knowledge that took years to acquire. Fermentation timing, temperature control, quality assessment, these skills could not be taught quickly. The company hired replacement workers where possible, but productivity and quality suffered. Advertising spending was cut by approximately 40%, partly to reduce costs, partly because the company wanted to avoid drawing attention. Visibility had become dangerous. Violence followed rhetoric. Anheuser-Busch saloons were vandalized in several cities, windows broken, signs torn down, interiors wrecked. Delivery wagons were attacked in German neighborhoods, drivers beaten, beer barrels smashed in the street. Local police rarely intervened with urgency. The attackers were performing patriotism. The victims were suspect by association. August could not openly protest without seeming to defend Germany. He could not remain silent without appearing complicit. The company absorbed the losses and tried to keep operating. The assault on German identity was not unique to Anheuser-Busch, but the company's size and visibility made it a prominent target. Editorial cartoons depicted the brewery as a tool of German propaganda. Temperance advocates, already hostile to alcohol, used the war to link beer with enemy influence. They argued that drinking beer funded German interests, that breweries undermined American morals, that prohibition was both a health measure and a patriotic act. The overlap between anti-German sentiment and the temperance movement was strategic. Each amplified the other. The war made prohibition more politically viable. Prohibition rhetoric made German Americans more vulnerable. August Senior navigated as best he could. He performed loyalty loudly and expensively. He reduced the company's profile. He waited for the war to end, hoping that peace would restore normalcy. The war did end on November 11, 1918. Germany surrendered. American troops returned home. But normalcy did not return. Anti-German hysteria had served a purpose for temperance advocates. It had normalized the idea that an entire industry, because of its ethnic associations, could be treated as a threat to national security. That idea, once established, did not require war to sustain it. The temperance movement had gained political momentum during the war. They had successfully linked beer to German subversion. Now they would press their advantage. The war was over. The attack on beer was just beginning. August had survived one existential threat. He would not survive the next. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on January 16, 1919. 36 states approved it, more than the required three-quarters majority. The amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. It would take effect 1 year later, on January 17, 1920, giving the industry time to prepare. Preparation meant liquidation. The Volstead Act, passed in October 1919 to enforce the amendment, defined intoxicating liquor as any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol. Beer, which typically contained 4 to 6% alcohol, was illegal. Wine was illegal. Spirits were illegal. The entire alcohol industry, breweries, distilleries, distributors, saloons, faced criminalization. Anheuser-Busch, the largest brewery in the world, had 1 year to find a new business or cease to exist. August Senior had seen prohibition coming. Temperance advocates had been gaining ground for decades. Multiple states had already enacted their own prohibition laws. A national ban was not a surprise. But anticipation did not mean readiness. The company had spent 50 years building infrastructure to produce and distribute beer. That infrastructure was now obsolete. Copper vats, fermentation cellars, bottling lines, refrigerated rail cars, tied house agreements, all of it designed for a product that would be illegal. August explored alternatives. The company launched Bevo in 1916, a near beer containing less than 0.5% alcohol, marketed as a soft drink, a healthy alternative to soda. Bevo was brewed like beer, then dilcoholized through heating. The process left a beverage that resembled beer in appearance, but tasted thin and flat. Sales were modest. At its peak in 1918, Bevo reached 5 million cases annually. Respectable, but nowhere near the revenue beer had generated. When Prohibition took effect in January 1920, Anheuser-Busch pivoted entirely. The brewery stopped producing beer and shifted to near beer, yeast for baking, malt syrup supposedly for baking and flavoring, non-alcoholic beverages, truck bodies, refrigerated cabinets, and commercial ice. The diversification was desperate. None of these products commanded the margins or volumes that beer had. Production collapsed. In 1913, the the brewery had produced 1.6 million barrels of beer. By 1921, near beer production reached 600,000 barrels, less than 40% of the former output. By 1925, production had fallen to 150,000 barrels, less than 10% of pre-Prohibition levels. Consumers did not want near beer. The taste was wrong. The ritual was wrong. Those who wanted alcohol found illegal sources, speakeasies, bootleggers, home brewing. Near beer satisfied no one. The workforce suffered immediately. In 1913, Anheuser-Busch employed over 6,000 workers. By 1925, the number had fallen to 1,200, an 80% reduction. Mass layoffs began in 1920 and continued for years. Skilled brewers, men who had spent decades learning fermentation science, were dismissed. Bottlers, barrel makers, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, all let go. Some found work elsewhere, many did not. The neighborhoods near the brewery, dependent on wages from Anheuser-Busch, emptied. Families moved away, stores closed, the social fabric built around the brewery unraveled. The company tried to soften the blow. Severance was offered where funds allowed. It was never enough. Financially, the company hemorrhaged. Anheuser-Busch lost money in 9 of Prohibition's 13 years. Near beer and side ventures generated revenue, but rarely profit. Fixed costs remained. Property taxes, maintenance, utilities, skeleton staff salaries, while income plummeted. The company sold assets to stay afloat. Real estate holdings went to buyers at depressed prices. Excess equipment was liquidated. Delivery horses were sold or given away. Anything convertible to cash was converted. The Busch family injected personal capital repeatedly to cover deficits. The company's value, estimated at $50 million in 1913, eroded steadily. By the early 1930s, the estimated loss exceeded $40 million. The empire Adolphus had built and August had inherited was dismantled piece by piece. One product sustained the company through Prohibition, though its purpose was never officially acknowledged: malt syrup. Sold in cans and advertised for baking and flavoring, malt syrup was also the primary ingredient in home brewing. Mix malt syrup with water and yeast, ferment for a week, and the result was beer. Illegal beer, but beer. Anheuser-Busch sold malt syrup in enormous quantities during Prohibition. The company never stated that customers were using it to brew alcohol at home, but the volumes suggested exactly that. Malt syrup production and sales kept the company marginally solvent when everything else failed. Federal agents suspected the company of enabling illegal brewing, but proving intent was difficult. Malt syrup itself was legal. What customers did with it was beyond the company's control, or so the company maintained. The ethical question remained: was Anheuser-Busch complicit in violating the law it publicly claimed to respect? The evidence suggests yes. The company sold a product knowing its primary use was illegal. That complicity was quiet, deniable, and profitable, enough to matter. August Senior aged badly during Prohibition. Photographs from the period show a man growing thinner, grayer, more withdrawn. He had spent 2 decades managing the company his father built, first through war, then through the destruction of the business itself. He had made the patriotic gestures, purchased the war bonds, pivoted to legal products, and watched the empire collapse anyway. By the early 1930s, repeal seemed possible. Public opinion had shifted. Prohibition was widely seen as a failure, unenforceable, and socially destructive. The 21st Amendment, repealing the 18th, was proposed in Congress in February 1933. States began ratifying it. Repeal was coming. Beer would be legal again. August did not live to see it. On February 13, 1934, he died at his home from a gunshot wound. He was 69 years old. The official account called it an accident, a gun discharging while being cleaned. Few believed that. The timing was telling. The 21st Amendment had been ratified on December 5, 1933. Beer was legal again. Anheuser-Busch had resumed production. The first post-Prohibition delivery had been made in a publicized ceremony. The company was rebuilding. August had survived Prohibition. The business had survived. And yet, the day before a major shipment was scheduled, he was dead. The most plausible interpretation is suicide. August could not reconcile what had been lost with what might be recovered. He had inherited the largest brewery in the world. He had watched it crumble under forces beyond his control. Repeal arrived too late to undo the damage, too late to restore what Adolphus had built. The weight of that failure, carried for 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days, was unbearable. Control passed to August Jr., known as Gussy, August Senior's son. Gussy was 35 years old. He inherited a company that was legally permitted to brew beer again, but practically destroyed. The infrastructure was decayed. The workforce was scattered. The brand was associated with a humiliating decade of near beer and malt syrup. Competitors who had survived Prohibition were also ramping up production, racing to reclaim market share. Gussy faced a rebuilding project that would take decades. The question was whether the Busch name still carried weight, whether consumers remembered Budweiser, whether the dynasty that had dominated American brewing could recover. Prohibition had not killed Anheuser-Busch. It had come close. The survival was technical, legal, barely financial. What returned after Repeal was not the empire Adolphus built. It was a shell, waiting to see if it could be filled again. The 21st Amendment was ratified on December 5, 1933. Repeal was immediate. States began issuing brewery licenses. Anheuser-Busch held one of the first. Beer flowed again on December 6, less than 24 hours after ratification. The company had prepared for months, repairing equipment, hiring workers, ordering ingredients. But preparation could not undo 13 years of decay. Copper vats needed retinning. Pipelines had corroded. Refrigeration systems required overhauls. The cellars, unused for brewing since 1920, needed cleaning and recertification. Production resumed slowly. In 1934, the brewery produced approximately 750,000 barrels, roughly half the output of 1913. The volume was respectable given the circumstances, but it revealed how far the company had fallen. Competitors who had survived Prohibition were also rebuilding. Market share was contested. Nothing was guaranteed. Gussy was not a visionary like his grandfather. He lacked Adolphus's charisma and his instinct for technological disruption. He also lacked August Senior's caution and his tendency toward despair. Gussy was a manager, persistent, practical, willing to make decisions and live with consequences. He understood that Anheuser-Busch needed more than production. It needed a rehabilitated image. Prohibition had damaged the brand. Budweiser was associated with a failed era, with near beer and malt syrup, with a company that had barely survived. Gussy set out to rewrite that narrative. He needed symbols. He found them in the past. The Clydesdales had been sold during Prohibition, the herd dispersed to cut costs. Gussy ordered the breeding program restored. In April 1933, before Repeal was finalized, he purchased an 8-horse team of Clydesdales. On April 7th, the day beer became legal again, the team pulled a red wagon loaded with Budweiser cases through the streets of St. Louis and then to Washington, where the beer was delivered to President Franklin Roosevelt at the White House. Photographers captured the spectacle. Newsreels showed the horses, their brass harnesses gleaming, pulling the wagon past cheering crowds. The delivery was theater, carefully staged. It linked Budweiser to patriotism, tradition, and celebration. The Clydesdales became inseparable from the brand. By 1940, the herd had been rebuilt to over 40 horses. Teams toured cities nationwide, appearing at parades, fairs, and public events. The horses communicated continuity. They suggested that Prohibition had been an interruption, not a collapse, and that Anheuser-Busch was the same company it had always been. That suggestion was false, but effective. Advertising resumed aggressively. Gussy poured money into radio sponsorships, buying airtime on popular programs. Sports became a focus: baseball, boxing, horse racing, events where beer and leisure overlapped naturally. The advertising avoided any mention of prohibition. It emphasized quality, tradition, and American identity. The goal was to make Budweiser feel inevitable, a brand that had always existed and always would. Print advertisements returned to newspapers and magazines. Billboards appeared along highways. The Clydesdales featured prominently: beautiful, powerful, nostalgic. The campaign worked. Sales climbed steadily through the late 1930s. By 1940, production reached 1.2 million barrels, 75% of the 1913 peak. The recovery was real but incomplete. Full restoration would take years. Gussy positioned himself not just as a manager, but as a dynasty builder. He had watched his father struggle and fail. He was determined to secure the family's future. He groomed his sons for succession, bringing them into the company, assigning them responsibilities, preparing them to take control when the time came. The mindset was dynastic. The Busch family would control Anheuser-Busch indefinitely. That required more than competence. It required visibility and cultural integration. Gussy pursued both. In 1953, he purchased the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team for $3.75 million. The team was struggling financially, attendance was down, and the previous owners wanted out. Gussy saw opportunity. Baseball was America's pastime. Owning a team linked Anheuser-Busch to the sport at its highest level. The brewery became the team's primary sponsor. Budweiser advertisements filled the stadium. The company logo appeared on scoreboards and programs. Gussy attended games regularly, sitting in a prominent box visible to fans and cameras. He integrated his personal identity with the company's. Gussy Busch was Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch was St. Louis. The Cardinals were St. Louis. The connections were deliberate and reinforced constantly. Baseball gave the company cultural legitimacy. It also gave Gussy a platform. He was no longer just a brewer, he was a civic figure, a sports owner, a public personality. In 1954, Gussy opened Grant's Farm to the public. The estate, purchased by the Busch family decades earlier, sat on 280 acres southwest of the city. The property included the family mansion, gardens, pastures, and a private zoo that Adolphus had started. Gussy expanded the zoo, added animal exhibits, and developed tour routes. The Clydesdales were housed there. Stabled in barns visitors could tour. The farm was marketed as a living museum of Busch family history. In its first year, Grant's Farm welcomed over 100,000 visitors. Admission was free. The experience was carefully curated. Visitors saw manicured grounds, well-fed animals, beautiful horses, and a narrative of family stewardship and generosity. What they did not see was labor history. No mention of the workers who built the brewery or the mass layoffs during Prohibition. No acknowledgement of union suppression or child labor. No discussion of August Senior's suicide. Grant's Farm presented a sanitized past, a story of benevolent leadership and American success. The Clydesdales, prominently featured, served as the emotional anchor. Visitors left associating Anheuser-Busch with beauty, tradition, and wholesomeness. Gussy led the company for 41 years, from 1934 to 1975, the longest tenure of any Busch CEO. He rebuilt what Prohibition had destroyed. He restored Budweiser to market dominance. He positioned his sons to continue the dynasty. He also rewrote the company's history, erasing the humiliations and failures, replacing them with Clydesdales and baseball. The strategy worked. By the 1960s, Anheuser-Busch was again the largest brewery in America. Budweiser was synonymous with beer itself. The Prohibition years were rarely discussed. When mentioned, they were framed as a temporary challenge the company overcame through resilience and ingenuity. The reality that the company had nearly collapsed, that August Senior had taken his own life, that malt syrup sales had kept the business marginally solvent by enabling illegal brewing, was buried beneath manufactured tradition and relentless marketing. Gussy did not restore the empire Adolphus built. He built something different. A brand sustained by spectacle, a dynasty maintained through myth, a company that survived not by making the best beer, but by telling the best story. By 1957, Budweiser became America's best-selling beer. It held that position for over 50 years. The achievement marked the completion of Gussy's restoration project. Anheuser-Busch was no longer recovering. It was dominant. The beer industry itself had transformed. In the 1930s, hundreds of regional breweries operated across the country, serving local markets with local brands. By the 1960s, consolidation had reduced the field to a handful of national corporations. Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Coors controlled the majority of the market. Scale determined survival. Smaller breweries couldn't match the advertising budgets, distribution networks, or production efficiencies of the giants. They were absorbed or bankrupted. The industry that had once supported diverse regional tastes became a three-way oligopoly, producing light lagers aimed at the broadest possible audience. Advertising became warfare. Television transformed how beer was marketed. Anheuser-Busch purchased airtime during sports broadcasts, primetime shows, and eventually the Super Bowl, where 30-second commercials cost millions of dollars. The company outspent competitors consistently. Budweiser ads emphasized Americana, working-class masculinity, leisure, and celebration. The Clydesdales appeared frequently, tying the brand to tradition and wholesomeness. Miller and Coors responded with their own campaigns, attacking Budweiser's dominance and offering alternatives. The competition was expensive and relentless. By the 1980s, Anheuser-Busch's annual advertising budget exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars. The spending worked. Market share climbed. At its peak in the 1980s and 90s, the company produced over 80 million barrels annually, roughly 50 times the output of Adolphus's era. Budweiser was not just the best-selling beer in America. It was one of the best-selling consumer products of any kind. In 1975, Gussy was forced out. He was 76 years old. The board, pressured by concerns about succession and management style, removed him and installed his son, August Busch III, as CEO. The transition was bitter. Gussy resented being pushed aside. August III, known as August III, was methodical and expansion-minded. He diversified the company beyond beer, building theme parks under the Busch Gardens brand, investing in real estate, acquiring snack food companies, and expanding international distribution. The diversification was strategic. Beer sales were strong, but relying on a single product in a maturing market carried risks. August III believed the company needed new revenue streams. The theme parks succeeded. Busch Gardens locations in Tampa and Williamsburg drew millions of visitors annually. The parks reinforced the family brand, offering roller coasters, animal exhibits, and entertainment tied to Anheuser-Busch's image. August III's tenure was profitable. The company grew, but cracks began to show. Family tensions surfaced publicly. The Busch family, now in its fourth and fifth generations, had expanded to dozens of heirs. Wealth was widespread, but control was concentrated. August III held power. Other family members removed from day-to-day operations grew resentful. Divorces, lawsuits, and scandals appeared in newspapers. Public disputes over inheritances and company direction damaged the dynasty's carefully cultivated image. The family that had once projected unity and stewardship now looked fractious and self-interested. August III managed the business competently, but he could not manage the family. Market conditions began shifting in the 1990s. A craft beer movement emerged, small breweries producing ales, stouts, and IPAs with bold flavors and local identities. Younger consumers, particularly those in urban markets, rejected mass-market lagers. Budweiser became associated with an older generation, their parents' beer, conventional and unadventurous. Market share began eroding slowly but persistently. In the 1980s, Anheuser-Busch controlled over 50% of the American beer market. By 2008, that figure had fallen to 43%, still dominant, but declining. Competitors like Miller and Coors merged to compete more effectively. Imports, particularly Mexican lagers, gained ground. The craft beer segment, once dismissed as a fad, grew into a significant market force. Budweiser remained the best-selling beer, but the trajectory was troubling. In July 2008, InBev, a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate formed through its own series of mergers, made a far hostile takeover offer for Anheuser-Busch. $52 billion, $70 per share. The offer was public and aggressive. August III opposed it. He argued that Anheuser-Busch was an American institution, that foreign ownership would damage the brand, that the company should remain independent. The board disagreed. Shareholders saw the price and the declining market position. They voted to accept. In November 2008, the sale closed. After 156 years, the Busch family lost control. August III was removed from management. The company was renamed Anheuser-Busch InBev. The Busch name remained, but only for branding. The family retained no operational authority. Shares were distributed among descendants, but decision-making moved to Brussels. The takeover marked the end of the dynasty as an operating entity. The Busch family was now simply wealthy, heirs to a fortune built over 5 generations, but divorced from the company that generated it. August IV, August III's son and the 5th-generation heir, had been groomed for succession. He worked in the company during his 20s and 30s, learning operations and management. The sale eliminated his path. He inherited wealth, name recognition, and no role. His struggles became public. Legal troubles, substance abuse issues, a failed marriage. In 2010, he survived a helicopter crash. His blood alcohol level was measured at 0.12%, above the legal limit. The crash investigation revealed a pattern of reckless behavior. August IV became a symbol of dynastic exhaustion, an heir born into wealth and expectation, but incapable of sustaining either. The modern era revealed what the dynasty had become, a brand without substance, a family without function. Anheuser-Busch endured, but as a subsidiary of a global corporation with no loyalty to St. Louis, American identity, or Busch family mythology. The Clydesdales still toured. Grant's Farm still welcomed visitors. The Cardinals, sold by the family in 1996, no longer carried the Busch name in their stadium. The brewery complex in St. Louis continued operating, but employment had fallen to a fraction of historic levels. Automation reduced the need for workers. Management decisions were made in Brussels by executives who viewed beer as a commodity, not a legacy. The 5th generation inherited money. They did not inherit purpose. The dynasty that Adolphus built, that August Senior struggled to preserve, that Gussy resurrected, and that August III expanded, ended not with collapse but with sale. The question of what the family had built was answered. They had built a corporation. Corporations are not loyal. They do not honor lineage. They serve shareholders. When a better price appeared, the dynasty was dissolved. What remained was wealth, stories, and horses pulling wagons in parades, beautiful and empty. The brewery still stands. The complex occupies over 100 acres of the original 142-acre site along the South St. Louis riverfront. Red brick towers rise against the skyline, visible from Interstate 55. The buildings look historic, industrial, permanent. Inside, the operation is modern. Stainless steel vats have replaced copper kettles. Computer systems monitor fermentation. Automated bottling lines fill thousands of containers per hour with minimal human oversight. The workforce numbers fewer than 1,000 employees, down from 6,000 in 1913 and 3,500 in 1905. Automation eliminated most positions. Engineers and technicians maintain machines. Managers coordinate logistics. The physical labor that once defined the brewery, the hauling, stacking, and manual filling, is performed by equipment. The company offers tours. Approximately 400,000 visitors walk through annually, paying for the experience of seeing where Budweiser is made. Guides narrate the brewing process, emphasize quality and tradition, and conclude at a hospitality room where guests sample product. The tours highlight history selectively. Adolphus Busch is celebrated as a visionary. Gussy's Clydesdale resurrection is recounted as triumph. Prohibition is mentioned briefly, framed as an obstacle the company overcame. What the tours omit is longer. No discussion of labor conditions, injury rates, or child workers. No mention of union suppression or ethnic division as management strategy. No acknowledgement that Busch Senior took his own life, or that the company survived Prohibition, partly through malt syrup sales that enabled illegal brewing. No reference to InBev ownership or the fact that decisions affecting the brewery are made in Belgium. The tour is curated heritage, a narrative designed to sell beer, not provoke questions. One Busch place, the mansion Adolphus built on the hill overlooking the brewery, no longer belongs to the family. It was sold in the 1980s, changing hands multiple times. The structure, approximately 30,000 square feet, remains standing, but is rarely photographed and seldom discussed publicly. Current ownership is private. The building has deteriorated. Maintenance is expensive. Historic preservation requirements limit renovation options. The mansion that once symbolized the dynasty's power now sits quietly, disconnected from the brand and the family, a relic without function. Grant's farm remains in Busch family control, managed through a trust. The estate opens to the public seasonally, welcoming over 500,000 visitors annually. Admission is free, funded by the trust and corporate sponsorships. Visitors tour animal exhibits, watch Clydesdale demonstrations, and explore grounds that present the Busch family as stewards of tradition and generosity. The farm functions as a theme park, history repackaged as entertainment. The narrative emphasizes benevolence, American values, and continuity. Photographs of Adolphus, Gussy, and the Clydesdales line the visitor center. No photographs show workers, tenements, or strikes. The story told at Grant's farm is clean, nostalgic, and incomplete. It is also effective. Generations of St. Louis families visit. Children grow up associating the Busch name with horses, animals, and pleasant afternoons. The sanitized past becomes collective memory. The Clydesdales persist. The herd exceeds 250 horses, stabled at Grant's farm and facilities in other states. Teams still tour, appearing at parades, fairs, and sporting events. They remain Anheuser-Busch InBev's most recognizable marketing tool. The irony is unavoidable. The horses, purchased by Adolphus in 1885, resurrected by Gussy in 1933, now promote beer for a Belgian-Brazilian corporation. The dynasty ended. The symbol survives. The Clydesdales have outlasted the family's control, their beauty appropriated by whoever owns the brand. They are tradition without continuity, heritage without inheritance. The secondary estates Adolphus and his heirs accumulated were sold off through the 20th century. The Pasadena property, the Cooperstown retreat, the German villa, all liquidated, subdivided, or demolished. Real estate was converted to cash when the family needed liquidity or when heirs chose to simplify holdings. Nothing remains intact. The worker housing near the brewery, the tenements that housed 400 families by 1900, was demolished during urban renewal projects in the 1960s and 70s. Not a single building survives. No plaques mark where they stood. The people who lived there, who worked in the freezing cellars and scalding brew houses, left no physical trace. Their labor built the dynasty. Their erasure is complete. The underground cellars, portions of which date to the 1880s, are partially preserved. They are used for corporate events, private parties, and specialized tours. Historical markers acknowledge their age and engineering. The markers do not mention the men who worked there, the frostbite, the pneumonia, the injuries. The cellars are presented as marvels of 19th century construction, not sites of human cost. The Busch family wealth is dispersed among an estimated 50 or more descendants. Some remain in St. Louis, others live elsewhere. The fortune, once unified under Adolphus and then August Senior, has fragmented across generations. No single heir commands significant influence. Some descendants are involved in business or philanthropy. Others live quietly on inherited income. The family name carries weight, but the dynasty as a functioning entity no longer exists. The brewery remains one of St. Louis's largest private employers, but no Busch family member holds civic leadership comparable to Adolphus or Gussy. The connection between family and city has weakened. The name endures in street signs, buildings, and the stadium that once bore it. The substance has dissipated. Memory is a battleground. Who controls the story? Tours at the brewery and Grant's Farm emphasize craftsmanship, tradition, and family legacy. They omit labor exploitation, Prohibition's near destruction of the company, August Senior's suicide, and foreign ownership. The omissions are not accidental. They serve the brand. Heritage sells beer. Complexity does not. Visitors leave with an impression of American success, immigrant achievement, and continuity. That impression is partial, carefully constructed, and profitable. The alternative story, the one told in archival records, injury reports, and deportation logs, remains inaccessible to most. The workers have no memorial. The mass layoffs during Prohibition are not commemorated. The Tide House system, the malt syrup complicity, the union suppression, the child labor, all of it exists in documents but not in public memory. What survived physically, the brewery, the cellars, Grant's Farm, tells the story the family wanted told. What was demolished or never built, the worker housing, the union halls, the gravestones of men who died in industrial accidents, tells the story that was discarded. The question is not what happened. The records exist. The question is what we choose to remember and who benefits from that choice. The Anheuser-Busch dynasty is the American story. Immigration, industry, innovation, consolidation, excess, collapse, and resurrection. It is also a story about what dynasties are and what they cost. Adolphus Busch arrived with ambition and married into opportunity. He built an empire through technological advantage, ruthless competition, and the labor of thousands whose names are forgotten. That is the first generation. Genius, vision, and the willingness to exploit every advantage. August Senior inherited stability and faced catastrophe. War turned his identity into liability. Prohibition criminalized his product. He could not adapt. His death, whether accident or suicide, marked the end of the dynasty as Adolphus imagined it. That is the second generation. Inheritance without the tools to defend it. Gussy rebuilt by rewriting. He made the Clydesdale symbols of continuity, bought a baseball team, opened the family estate to crowds, and erased the Prohibition years from public memory. That is the third generation, survival through mythology. August III expanded and diversified, but he could not control the family or the market. That is the fourth generation, competence without vision. August IV inherited wealth and no purpose, a life shaped by a dynasty that no longer existed. That is the fifth generation, exhaustion. Beer is ordinary. Millions drank Budweiser without thinking about how it was made or who made it. That invisibility was structural. The workers who descended into freezing cellars, who loaded barrels in summer heat, who lost fingers to machines, who sent their children to work because wages mattered more than school, built the product. The consumers never met them. The advertising never mentioned them. The tours still do not. Dynasties are built on other people's labor, other people's lives, other people's invisibility. Prohibition was a judgment. Society decided that alcohol was a moral problem and destroyed an entire industry overnight. The judgment was clumsy, unenforceable, and repealed within 15 years. But it revealed something. Economic power, no matter how vast, is contingent. Law can erase it. Taste can abandon it. The InBev takeover revealed something else. Family control cannot survive global capital indefinitely. When a foreign corporation offered $52 billion, shareholders accepted. The dynasty ended. The brand endured. The Clydesdale still tour, beautiful and empty, symbols manufactured in 1885 to suggest tradition that never existed, now owned by a Belgian conglomerate, still pulling wagons, still selling beer. What remains? A brand recognized worldwide, a story carefully curated, estates disconnected from their origins, wealth dispersed among descendants who did not build it, and the workers unnamed, unremembered, whose labor made all of it possible. The Anheuser-Busch dynasty was not unique, it was typical. Immigration provided opportunity, industry provided scale, innovation provided advantage, consolidation eliminated competition, excess defined success, decline was inevitable. What makes it American is the mythology. The Clydesdales, the baseball team, Grant's Farm, the tours, all of it designed to make the dynasty feel noble, generous, and deserved. The reality was less noble. Empires built on beer are still empires. They require the same things all empires require: resources, labor, ruthlessness, and the ability to control the story. The Busch family controlled the story for 156 years. Then they lost control. The story continues, but it no longer belongs to them. Was the Anheuser-Busch dynasty the American dream fulfilled, or American capitalism's most perfect illusion? The question answers itself. It was both.